Good evening all and welcome. I am delighted to be joined by you, but also by Dr. Edie Friedman, who is the founder and director of JCORE, the Jewish Council for Racial Equality. The last year has highlighted in many ways a growing trend for identity politics, profiling. We are seeing racism on the rise as we may have never imagined in the tensions around the world through the populist politicians and increased by the tensions around the COVID virus. We are seeing bombings, we are seeing language, we are seeing beatings and knifings, and we're becoming increasingly sensitive also to the institutionalized racism that we see within society, unequal access to facilities, information, to support. And there's no point in me telling you about it because we have an expert to be able to share that with you now, but also to share a very proud Jewish tradition of campaigning against racism, and not just our own self-interest and our own experience, but also critically and very importantly, the role that the Jewish community has played often in campaigning for the freedom of others. Edie grew up in America, was involved in the civil rights movement, she will tell you when, and came over to this country where she was studying and fell in love with the country, has fallen in love with walks, has fallen in love with people, and has been right at the forefront of a Jewish anti-racist activity. I hand over to Dr. Edie Friedman.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Lawrence, and good evening, everyone. So I'll speak for about 30 minutes, and after that, I would be very happy to take any questions or comments that you may have. So to begin, the slide should be going down. Why isn't this happening, Rabbi Lawrence?
If you click on, try clicking on your slide.
Oh, right.
Or,
okay. Aha. Thank you very much. With me and technology, it's really.
I'm still seeing your initial slide.
Now I can see the second slide.
That's good for you.
Right. Can everybody else see the second slide? It says about JCORE.
Wave at me if you're still seeing the A History of Jewish Anti-Racism Activity slide. You are. All right, Edie, I am going to share my screen.
Okay.
I will share the slides. Don't take it personally. Okay, everybody can now see the initial slide, and everybody can now see the second slide. Is that good?
Yes.
Edie, you can?
Okay, yeah.
All right, so you start talking, I'll manage the slides.
Okay, so I just have to say next, please. Okay, right. Lovely, thank you. Well, just before I begin, let me just say a few words about JCORE, the Jewish Council for Racial Equality, which I started in 1976, working in three main areas: developing race equality education, primarily, though not exclusively, for Jewish schools, developing Black, Asian, Jewish dialogue, and working on refugee and asylum issues on two levels. One, a very practical one of befriending unaccompanied minors and mentoring refugee doctors. And we also campaign for a better deal for refugees and asylum seekers. And what we try to do in an overall sense is to provide a Jewish voice on race and asylum issues. So next slide, please. Right, so for tonight's talk, I'm looking at history, and of course there are many different ways of looking at history. So I want to look at this issue of Jewish involvement in combating racism in three countries: the United States, South Africa, and the UK. And I want to look at some of the major players and some of the significant dates. But I also want to look at some of the unsung heroes, people who aren't necessarily household names, either in this country or their country of their birth, but people whose day-to-day actions actually help to chip away at racism. And finally, I'd just like to say something about our emotional connection to this history. And of course, history is very subjective, and what I'm doing this evening is just providing a snapshot, and inevitably there will be things that I have missed out. So next slide, please. So just a bit of background, or start with the United States, and to say that the civil rights movement, as it was called, was the struggle for social justice that took place mainly in the 1950s and the 1960s for Black Americans to get equal rights under the law. And even though slavery was officially abolished, it didn't actually end discrimination against Black people. And we had the very infamous Jim Crow laws, which instituted enforced segregation, both in the states and as well in local laws. And these infamous laws lasted until 1965, so pretty recent history. In 1964, we had the Civil Rights Act, and then the Voting Rights Act in 1965. And so by the mid-20th century, Black Americans, along with some white Americans, mobilized and began the unprecedented fight for equality that went over 2 decades. And I just wanted to show a few snaps of what the sort of apartheid that we had in the United States, what it looked like. And I have to say that once when I was looking at the days when one was allowed to go to museums, there was an exhibition of civil rights in the United States and apartheid in South Africa. And it was really sort of eerie in that you really couldn't tell the difference between the two countries in many respects. And it's worth saying that there were signs, particularly in the South, which stated where African Americans could legally walk, talk, sit, drink, rest, and eat. There were segregated facilities which extended from white-only schools to white-only graveyards. Next slide, please. I wanted to show this picture of a quite infamous event. So this was called the Stand in the Schoolhouse Door, which took place at Foster Auditorium at the University of Alabama in June 1963. And in the middle, you see the then governor of Alabama, George Wallace, in a symbolic attempt to keep his inauguration promise of segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever, and to stop the desegregation of schools. So he stood at the door of the auditorium to try to block the entry of 2 African-American students, Vivian Malone and James Hood. In response to this, the then President of the United States, John Kennedy, sent in the Alabama National Guard and commanded Wallace to step aside. Wallace spoke further, but he did eventually move, and Malone and Hood completed their registration. But this incident actually brought Wallace into the national spotlight. Many years later, there was an assassination attempt on his life, and he repented his ways and said he had a conversion. Next slide, please. So let's look at Jewish involvement before the 1960s. So this is before the heyday of the civil rights movement. It was said that in the 19th century, Jewish shopkeepers were the only shopkeepers who allowed Black customers to try on clothes and actually address them by Mr. and Mrs. rather than just by their first name. A prominent Jewish writer called Louis Isaac Jaffe won the Pulitzer Prize for his work in talking about lynching. Julius Rosenwald and his daughter funded many projects within the Black community, and a rabbi in New Orleans invited the then UN ambassador Ralph Bunche to speak, and this was the first time that a Black person was invited to speak in New Orleans. 1957 to 58, the Ku Klux Klan instigated a number of anti-Semitic attacks. And though many Jews did speak out, many Jews did not speak out, and there was anxiety that if they did speak out, they would become the target of the Ku Klux Klan. But whatever people did, the Ku Klux Klan had their own agenda, and certainly as part of that agenda was anti-Semitism. Next slide, please. Continuing looking at Jewish involvement, now moving into the 1960s, there's an incident which I learned about fairly recently, where 16 rabbis were arrested at a sort of dive-in at the Monson Motor Lodge. This, like many places, was segregated, and so there was, as you would find, a demonstration where people just literally went to the place in order to desegregate it. And it was said that as soon as one rabbi was pushed aside, another one took his place. And the picture, which is on my right, is a reunion of some of the rabbis. And I guess it was like 50 years. They reunited in 2020. So this is the swimming pool dive-in protest. Next slide, please. Wanted to mention 1964, which was a very tragic year in that 3 civil rights leaders, 2 of whom were Jewish, Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner, together with their Black colleague, James Chaney, were murdered when they went down to help with voter registration in Mississippi. It later became the theme of a film called Mississippi Burning, and here is a picture of Martin Luther King holding up a picture of Andrew Goodman, Michael Schwerner, and James Chaney. Next slide, please. 1965, you have a picture, and now there are several of these pictures of Rabbi Abraham Heschel marching with Martin Luther King in Alabama. And Heschel said that marching was like praying with his feet. There was recently saw a film about Black Americans and solidarity with the Jewish community. And in this film, it talked about an incident where Martin Luther King went down to the Catskills to meet up with Heschel. And as he walked into the room, it was said that 1,000 rabbis sang, "We shall overcome" in Hebrew. A really lovely story. So 1965, Rabbi Abraham Heschel marching with Martin Luther King. It is important to remember that Jews made up during this time just under 3% of the whole population, but certainly played a disproportionate role in the civil rights movement. And I'll come to some of these figures later. Next slide, please. This is Freedom Song. So going down to the South was a very brave thing to do, a very unpredictable thing to do, because you didn't know, even if your life was not in jeopardy, and for many people, it was a very anxious time because you did not know when law enforcement agents would tell the Ku Klux Klan what you were doing, and that's what happened to Schwerner and Goodman and Cheney. And as a way of trying to relax some of the volunteers, people used to sing songs. And so this is a picture of a group of black and white young people singing freedom songs such as We Shall Overcome. And I remember my own experience of working in a Jewish summer camp in Wisconsin and singing many of these songs. And at the time, in the 1960s, you felt that just singing these songs would help to create a better world for everyone. So these sort of freedom songs became very, very important. Just going back to why it was so necessary to do things which reinforce solidarity and hopefully could make people feel more relaxed, that during this period, 6 activists were murdered. There were about 1,000 arrests, 80 beatings, 35 shootings, and 30 bombings. So it was a very difficult and very precarious time. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to mention a couple of case studies which illustrate Jewish involvement in the civil rights movement. This is the picture of the Saperstein family, and you have in the middle Rabbi Harold Saperstein and his wife Marcia, and on both sides are their sons, who are Rabbi David Saperstein and Rabbi Mark Saperstein. And Senior Rabbi Saperstein and his wife taught geography classes at the Freedom School in Selma, Alabama in 1965 to a group of Black children, many of whom had never been more than a few miles from Selma. And he recalls their excitement at being told about their country, the United States, which few knew very little about, if anything. And he and Marcia attended meetings where very often they were the only white people. And commenting on the talks he gave at these gatherings, Rabbi Saperstein said that he spoke, I speak as a white, I speak as a Jew, I speak as a rabbi, and I assured them that their problem was our problem because we were all human beings. And he hoped that his presence and his words would give people that extra strength and hope and faith in the United States. Also that year, their son, Rabbi Mark Saperstein, also went down to Alabama, where he returned the following year to teach English. Also, Mark in 1965 joined the last day of that iconic march led by Martin Luther King, which went from Selma to Montgomery. And the second year, he taught English 5 days a week to Black students. And when he told them that he was going to Cambridge to study, Cambridge, England, the following year, he was asked, do they allow colored students to go there? I wanted to mention the Saperstein family because what they did was both so ordinary, but also so terribly brave. And I think these unsung heroes really need to be recognized. Next slide, please. Right, another case study, one that I am very familiar with, is an incident that happened in my sorority in the Midwest in the United States. And I would imagine that many of you are familiar with the sorority and fraternity system. So this was a sorority that I joined, which was mainly Jewish, because Jewish women and men for the fraternities would have found barriers to joining what pretty much was a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant institution. Anyway, to cut a very long story short, a Black woman attempted to join the sorority, and though at first she was allowed to proceed, she was eventually blackballed in an act of quite blatant discrimination. And by 1969, racial discrimination was actually illegal. And after pleading with the sorority to see the error of their ways, 3 of us, all of us were Jewish, were involved in accusing them of racial discrimination, which resulted in a university hearing. And the verdict was that discrimination did occur, and it wasn't the only factor, but nevertheless, racial discrimination did occur. And I have to say that this experience was very difficult and painful and extremely emotional, and many friendships were lost. And I think one of the saddest parts of it, it showed the power of the institution won over what people thought were right. And though a number of people said what you were doing was absolutely the correct thing to do, that when it came to testifying against an institution such as this sorority, they felt that they were unable to do this. So, a little snapshot of activism in the United States. So next slide, and which I think then moves us over to South Africa. So a reminder of South Africa, where you would find benches saying whites only, drinking fountains for white and in this picture and colored people, and signs for use, which would say things like for use by white people, that they are reserved for white people only. Jews at the time of apartheid made up about 2% of the entire population, and like in the United States, they played a disproportionate role. And what I wanted to also comment about the United States is that it was said by Black civil rights leaders that Jewish people did play a disproportionate role, and there were estimates that though they made up what, 2-3% of the entire United States population, they made up between 25 and 50% of the white activists involved in fighting for civil rights. So, like the United States and South Africa, Jewish people did play a disproportionate role. And it was estimated, though these figures are hard to come by, that half of the white activists were Jewish. Just a little bit of reminder about apartheid, that when the National Party came to power in 1948, the all-white government immediately enforced laws of racial discrimination. And under apartheid, non-white South Africans, who were, after all, the majority of the population, were forced to live in separate areas and use separate public facilities. And despite very strong and consistent opposition to apartheid, both within and outside of South Africa, it remained in effect for the best part of 50 years. Next slide, please. So here we have a picture of Nelson Mandela and two other African National Congress participants. And we have also to my left a picture of Joe Slovo. And Mandela began his autobiography saying that I found Jewish people to be more broad-minded than most whites on the issue of race and politics, because perhaps they themselves have historically been victims of prejudice. After graduating, it was an Orthodox Jew, Lazar Skidelsky in Johannesburg, who gave Mandela his first job as an article clerk at a time when few others would have done that. And Rabbi Skidelsky's son, who also became a rabbi, followed in his father's footsteps of being an opponent in a very practical way of apartheid. And there were some very towering figures who were Jewish in the anti-apartheid movement. Joe Slovo, his wife, Ruth First, who was tragically assassinated in Mozambique, where she was in exile. Helen Suzman, Dennis Goldberg, Abby Sachs, Sam Khan, Yeti Barenblatt, Jaime Barcel. And some of these activists were imprisoned and faced solitary confinement, torture, and even death. And the lucky ones went into exile. There's some story of a woman, Sam Khan, who was with his whole family were involved in combating apartheid. And there was a story that it was a Sunday morning, and I think he took one of the children someplace and rang his wife, and she said to him, "Sam, scram," which meant get out of the country, which he did. And they later found exile in Hampstead Garden suburb, where his wife became a neurologist, I believe. Mandela's lawyer, Joel Joffe, was Jewish. 14 defendants from the outlawed National Congress were Jewish, but so too was the prosecutor who initially sought the death penalty for Mandela. Next slide, please. So some unsung heroes of the fighting apartheid. This is a picture of some ballet teachers, and a Jewish woman called Fonda Dub, opened a ballet school for Black children. Sylvia Glasser taught Black ballet dancers during this time, and that led to the establishment of the country's most important contemporary dance company. And a number of very important trade unionists were also Jewish. Next slide, please. Wanted to mention the Black Sash movement. So the Black Sash movement was formed in 1955, and it was a small but very strongly motivated band of women, many of them Jewish, who were involved were Jewish women in it were involved far outside their numbers. These women were described as neither Marxist or ex-communist, but ordinary stay-at-home mothers, members of WITSO, lawyers, medics, teachers, and even one who sewed shrouds for the Burial Society. The Black Sashers would stand in silence outside City Hall on this market square, flanked by a statue of Queen Victoria. They felt they needed to use their privileged status as white women to escort African women to police stations to try to discover why and where their loved ones had, quote, disappeared to. And then they would write up the evidence and they became witnesses. The Black Sash symbolized mourning for the lost Constitution. One woman in Port Elizabeth recalls that when she was working for her doctorate, she was offered a job at the university, but she was asked to sign a conscience clause that she would never teach Black students. She refused, and the university relented. Some of the involvement of groups like the Black Sashers and others did bring some tension between them and some parts of the Jewish establishment. But like the United States, many Jewish individuals did their bits, such as teaching English, which did bring with it personal risk, social isolation from some, but also solidarity with others. So let's move on to the next slide, and we look at the UK. There was a time before we had race relations legislation that you could see a sign that said no Irish, no Blacks, no dogs. Sometimes these signs also said no Jews as well. And like the other countries, individual Jews did play a disproportionate role, though not the community as such, not the established community as such, in doing something about racism. And it's interesting about why things were different here. And was it because racism in the UK was not as overt as it was in both South Africa and the United States? Next slide, please. Two Jewish men, Jim Rhodes and Anthony Lester, formed the very influential race relations think tank, the Runnymede Trust. Jeffrey Beinman and Anthony Lester, two Jewish lawyers, drafted the Race Relations Act 1965, 1968, 1976. Jews were prominent in the Anti-Nazi League and other anti-fascist organizations. Other prominent Jews included Aubrey Rose, the solicitor, Morris Orbach, the MP, Ruth Glass, the author. The Board of Deputies set up a Defense and Group Relations Committee. Next slide, please. And this is a picture of a report produced in 1968 called Improving Race Relations, a Jewish Contribution. And I don't remember who told me about this, but I rang up, and a certain Clive Lawton, who was working at the board, was very excited that someone knew about this, and that got me a copy from the filing cabinet in the hope that we could resuscitate some of the recommendations that were made in this report. Next slide, please. So another Jewish response to combating racism was the creation of JCORE. And those days it was easier. You see a picture of Merlin Reese, who was then Home Secretary. It was easier to get an audience with the Home Secretary, and people were also recognized Gabor Janner as well. Next slide, please. So JCORE, as I said before, was formed in 1976 in order to provide a Jewish voice on race and asylum issues. We draw on Jewish refugee experience, Jewish teaching, and the tradition of Jewish social activism. And one of the things we did, we started Black Asian Jewish Dialogue, is we had what was then called a West Indian Asian Jewish Evening. And it was emceed by the United Synagogue, the main United Synagogue rabbi in Leeds, Rabbi Brown. And we catered for 50 people, and over 600 came. So he sort of made a little joke about the loaves and the fishes, which people thought was very amusing and helped to sort of reinforce a sense of togetherness. We repeated the exercise the following year and had 1,000 people. Next slide, please. So how do we feel about this history of Jewish involvement in these three countries? There are questions such as how we as an individual would have responded. What a number of these individuals did, even something as simple as teach English, brought with it danger and being ostracized and, being placed in a situation which was really very scary and very unpredictable. And what do we do with this history? Do we file it away? I heard what I thought was a quite telling statement, which said, how do we carry each other's stories? Because both this involvement, the Jewish involvement, there are many stories there. And I think it's a real question about, do we learn enough about this involvement? And it's really important that we do, because this is part and parcel of Jewish experience and Jewish history. And we have to think how much of this is a positive legacy and how much of it can also be thought of for some people as a negative one. So I'd like to, on the next slide, mention some of the negative things about this legacy of Black Jewish cooperation. There has been tensions sort of after the heyday of the civil rights movement in the United States, tension between Black and Jewish activists, causing some resentment. The Jewish contribution to combating racism went unappreciated. There was a conflict in Brooklyn schools in 1968, and a terrible incident in Crown Heights in 1991, when two children were hit by a car in a motorcade of the Lubavitcher rabbi. And 7-year-old Gavin Cato was killed. And in retaliation, a student, Yanko Rosenbaum, was killed. But fortunately, both communities joined together to try to reduce tension and create an outreach program to bring people together. Affirmative action also caused some tensions between the Black and Jewish communities, the rise of Black power, and inevitably tensions over Palestine, Israel. Next slide, please. But I would hope that many would also argue that this is a very positive legacy, because no action is without some difficulties. History just doesn't go in one direction, but by honoring this and looking at it both for its positive and its negative sides, it helps us to reclaim our own proud history of social activism. And it's really important, I think, as we forge and we continue to forge and to sustain a Jewish identity, that we see Jewish identity bound up in our commitment, in our ability to be involved in trying to create a better world for all of us. And certainly the the Jewish involvement in combating racism in different parts of the world is something that very much can help both forge and sustain a positive Jewish identity. And that the overall struggle for social justice really should be seen as part and parcel of one's Jewishness. And it raises questions now about our commitment to combating racism, and certainly after the murder of George Floyd, many communities, many organizations in different parts of the world were re-examining what a commitment ought to look like. And this is something, of course, that also has been done in the UK as well. But it does require a lot of work to think, well, what does commitment look like? And how can we build bridges between Black, Asian, and Jewish communities so that we create a better Britain for all of us? And we know that there are many pressures, and COVID certainly has exposed levels of inequality in the country, and even things such as Black and Asian communities um, experiencing and suffering from having COVID having a disproportionate effect on Black and Asian communities compared to the rest of the population. So there are some real questions about poverty as well, that Black children have poverty rates twice those of white children. People who are poor and live in overcrowded accommodation also experience the worst health outcomes as well. So it becomes a vicious circle. And there are real questions about what we within the community can do, both within the community and working with others to create a better society, as I said, for all of us, which is, I think, an important way of forging and sustaining a positive Jewish identity. And I think that is the last slide, if I remember correctly. But now just to ask you if you have any questions or thoughts. And thank you very much. And I hope I haven't gone beyond my 30 minutes.
No, it's been very good. Thanks very, very much, Edie. Does anybody have any questions? Please flag on the participants or wave vigorously, and I will try and see you, or I hope to see you. I have the gallery view up. So Edie, how do you get involved in anti-racist activity?
Well, I think with sort of being a part of 1960s America, many Jewish people, not only young people, but many Jews just were involved in social justice issues. And the two big issues at that time were the civil rights movement and the war in Vietnam. And certainly both of them brought many people out, literally on the street. But I remember at university, a number of us took a class in Judaism 101 or whatever things are called in the United States. And the rabbi helped us to sort of see the connection between our interests and our involvement in social justice issues and our Jewishness. And we all, the penny dropped. So it was that time when it was just an important thing. There was a sort of imperative, and all sorts of things were mixed together. Having John Kennedy, with all of his faults, which of course became more noticeable years later, but one did feel that there were ways of just making the world a better place. And so the combination of John Kennedy, followed by his brother, who was also tragically assassinated a few months after Martin Luther King was assassinated. Also, there were terrible riots in Chicago and Los Angeles, other places. So it was a time, and some students were killed by the National Guard in two university campuses. Kent State, 4 students were killed, and Black students in a university in the South were killed when they were demonstrating. So there was an awful lot of social involvement. So it became, I don't want to say it became the thing to do, but it just seemed that is what one had to do. So it became a very natural thing, and probably not necessarily thinking about it very much.
So you talk about a culture and the American experience which motivated you, but you set up JCORE here. What was it here that made you professionalize your interest or take it to the next level?
Well, some of it was a sort of negative thing in that when I was involved, just in a little way, in interfaith dialogue, I would hear Christians quoting Jewish prophets for why they were involved, and I just wanted to hear more Jewish people quoting Jewish prophets. And then a Jewish woman said to me, "I'm glad you do the Christian thing and love your neighbor." And I thought, Oop. So I felt that it was about reclaiming that sort of prophetic tradition of social justice and not allowing other people to have the monopoly on it. So that was a sort of negative thing, but it also, that was very much tied up in something positive, that, it was very much about forging a positive Jewish identity and being involved in those sort of things that could help. But here, unlike the United States, well, less so. The community as such, though we had a disproportionate number of individuals involved in these issues, the community as such was not as involved. And I wanted to bring the two together because people would say, well, it's easier if you want to combat racism to do it outside the Jewish community. And I wanted to do it within the community. And it was a way of bringing the two together.
Possibly a contentious question. There's your piece is very positive about the Jewish leaders who have been involved in fighting against racism, and I've got a picture of Heschel and King behind me. We've been very good and at the forefront of a lot of anti-racist campaigns. What about the racism that emanates and the prejudice that is within the Jewish community? Do you have any comments on that and how we can fight it?
Well, that was also part of the reason for starting JCORE, and also wanting to create education material so that Jewish children could learn about these issues naturally within the Jewish curriculum. There is undoubtedly prejudice within the Jewish community, is there is prejudice within all communities. As we know, there can be prejudice within the Jewish community about other Jews as well. So I think one would want to tackle these things in a positive way, and that's why, as I say, we created material for primary school and secondary school and for under 5 so that children could learn about these issues. Because I think one of the important questions is, as a young person, what is my responsibility of creating a good and healthy multiracial society here in Britain? And so it's about examining one's racism without making people feel guilty, but to recognize that, prejudice is a fact of life. We have to overcome it, and that we have to do something about the institutional racism that still means that Black people are disproportionately poor, they're disproportionately unemployed, they're disproportionately living in bad housing. the disproportionately getting the worst health outcomes. And we have to, that is not a good society when people are disproportionately um, are the victims. So we have to create a better society for all of us. And certainly, some people, would argue that because we have been discriminated against, because we have been asylum seekers, because we've been refugees, because we have been economic migrants, that we have a responsibility to be involved in these sort of issues. And this is also one of the many debating areas about, do we have a special responsibility because we have been victims ourselves. But I'd like to think of this as not about victimhood, but it's about positive participation. And sometimes I think we also need to think about our Jewishness. Sometimes it could be too much about anti-Semitism, and this is not to say that anti-Semitism is not a problem, but that we also need to think about sort of a positive engagement with the world as well. So it's that positive side which I think is so important.
Is there anything in particular that you think that we can do from our lockdown homes in Finchley?
Well, I have one of the things which I can send tomorrow. We produced something because after George Floyd was murdered, and we did this huge event with JW3. They said 10,000 people watched. That's a little bit bigger than the usual JCORE audience, I have to say. One of the things that we did was produce something called 10 Things You Could Do to Combat Racism. And I'd be happy to send that to you. And it's some very simple things like reading Black authors, being more aware of voices within the Black community, because Black people don't speak with one voice any more than Jews speak with one voice. And there are some very practical things. And certainly, I mean, and I know you had Stephen Bush at the synagogue looking at the position of Black Jews, Jews of color within the community, and how we can make communal spaces more welcoming in a non-patronizing way, but nevertheless more welcoming to do the diversity which is within the Jewish community. I think there's a lot, we're pretty unaware about Black Jews, Jews of color, and I think there is also a lot of things that we need to learn about each other, and just reading voices from Africa, voices from Black communities here, first, second, third generation people. There's a real richness that we deny ourselves if we don't become familiar with this. So I'd be happy, I'll send you this tomorrow, this 10 things. And, it also is a great discussion point, and also for, within Cheder environment as well. It raises all sorts of issues.
Does anybody else have any questions for Edie?
I haven't talked you into silence, I hope.
Do you think the Jewish community should be formally marking the George Floyd anniversary?
Well, I think we need to think about that. I think it was such a big event on one level, and such a not very big event on another level, because George Floyd was certainly not the first person to be killed like that. And yet his death just sparked off this huge emotional engagement in different parts of the world. So I think it would be a really good thing to. I think it could be a really good thing, and I think we need to think about different ways of doing it, and and what could be done for within schools, and within the Cheder setting, and within synagogues. because these are complicated issues, and I think they take a range of different activities to help to understand them. So, I mean, the answer is yes, definitely, and I think we need to think about how best to do that. One thing that we did is we drew up a statement about solidarity with Black communities, and we had the Board of Deputies, the Community Security Trust, and the Jewish Leadership Council all sign it. And someone said I could win a Nobel Peace Prize for getting all three of those organizations to sign something. And perhaps I'll send you the statement, because also a range of different communal organizations signed it as well. So I think just talking about the issue in itself is one important thing that we could do.
Julia.
Well, you are originally, Rabbi, asked what was my first question, which is what more would you suggest we all do? But I guess the next question, which is a little different iteration of it, is for those of us with kids. I think one of the things that I see with my children is they go to a Jewish school and there aren't any people, any Black or Asian or Chinese or any other sort of different ethnic groups, let's say, within the school. And how do I think that then leads to a fear of the other, not necessarily a fear, but a notice of difference of the other, to the extent that I remember when there was a Black caretaker joined the school when my son was very young. He's sort of, oh, he's got different coloured skin, and it's embarrassing to hear that in London, in 2015, whatever it was. But what can we do more for our kids to remove that difference of the other when we are surrounding them, if we do send them to Jewish schools, in what's a vastly white environment?
Well, I think one very simple thing to do is to look at the books that the children are reading. There are lots of really great books which show the country as it looks. So you have just not superheroes, but just ordinary people in storybooks who happen to be Black or happen to be Asian. And obviously there are other areas of diversity as well. So there's a lot that can be done. We've produced, as I say, we produced a handbook for the under fives, for the sort of nursery environment, and one for primary school and secondary school. And we would be delighted if anybody would like any of these, though they're particularly the primary and secondary one, some of the information now is out of date. Most of the information is still relevant about what things can you do. I mean, one simple thing that we did was and it fits so naturally within Jewish experience, but when we introduce a subject like of refugees, you just ask the children about, well, their grandparents or great grandparents, because by and large, many of them would not have been born eventually. And it's a way of saying about other people's parents and grandparents, and etc. So if you would like these packs, we would be delighted. We have many copies.
I've just posted in the chat the JCORE website, and to be in touch for details, links.
I guess I just wonder whether you think that and not necessarily Kinloss, but whether the communal institutions could do more, because of course individually we all have our own conversations, and those are really the basis of these. But yeah, should schools be making bridge links with non-Jewish schools that also have this diversity within them?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. And I think that they need help doing it, but there are models of good activities that have happened between one school and another. So, and I think, we're in discussions now, and I'm always mispronouncing the Jewish education secondary school. What? You know who I mean. That coordinates a lot of the, I think, just secondary.
Pages.
Yes, thank you. And we're in discussions now about doing some work for their new curriculum as well. So these discussions are ongoing at the moment. We're also in discussion with JFS as well. So I would, and we really need some teachers who could help us do this in a way that is sensitive to the Jewish curriculum in a way that it will be used. So if there are any teachers out there, we would love to hear from you. But I think we just need to do more collaborative work in thinking about how we can introduce these subjects in a way that students can identify, because there's a real rich history which very often people are unfamiliar with. And that is, and Heschel's thing is a case in point. I mean, how many of us knew that, Heschel and Martin Luther King walk into the Catskills and 1,000 rabbis are singing, "We shall overcome" in Hebrew. I mean, there's some of these stories are almost gold. So I think that sort of understanding of that diversity within our own experience is also, we need to look at the curriculum that we're presenting to our children. And I'm hoping these discussions will lead to some sort of integration. But within the primary classroom, there are numerous things that can be done. But do please contact me and our virtual office. Well, we have a real office in Golders Green, but it's pretty virtual at the moment.
We've got Jews of color who are in Saxmore Shaw Primary School, and
Sure.
that exposure is healthy, though. The students themselves, or the student itself, it does have a sense of feeling different, and it's a challenge. It's an educational challenge. I think another great challenge must be for Jews of color who are in the non-Jewish system, and have multiple areas of identity where they are, where they might be in conflict with either the majority or even put one side against the other. Do you have any particular views or insights that you can share on that?
Where there's, sorry, did you say competition?
Jews of color in the non-Jewish school system who, they might not be accepted by the Jews within the system. They might not be accepted by the by the colored community within the system.
Yeah. No, I mean, we have to find ways of talking to each other, because I mean, this whole thing about Jews of color needs to be better recognized both within the Jewish and within the Black community. So we have a lot of work together, and I think we've sort of ignored that dimension of our experience, of our reality, so that Jews of color can become thought of as quite exotic, and their presence within the wider Black community. I mean, we know how complex everything is, and are Jews an ethnic minority, even white Jews, and how do we fit in as sort of, in terms of racialized minorities things? These are very, we're not necessarily like other white people, but in other ways we are like other white people. And having a foot in both camps is very complex, isn't it? But it needs to be talked about. It needs to be talked about within the Jewish world as well within the Black world. Recently saw something on television about a documentary about Sammy Davis Jr. I don't know, those of us of a certain age might remember Sammy Davis Jr. Those of us may not. So this magnificent entertainer who, people, and he said, what do people make? I'm a one-eyed Black Jew. And how, and all the problems that he faced, certainly because of being a Black person, and that he played in the most, fabulous, famous places in Las Vegas, but, wouldn't be allowed to stay in a motel in Las Vegas. He had to stay down the road where, Black people were accepted. So there's a lot that we need to uncover and to know about the history. Do we teach about what happened to Stephen Lawrence? Is that part of what children actually understand? I mean, it's such an important event in terms of Britain's sense of itself, and how it also changed things in asking us how we understand anti-Semitism, as well as other areas of racism. But it was such an important thing, and there are numerous case studies like Stephen Lawrence that need to be brought into our curriculum.
Fitting to mention that the Judge Sir William Macpherson, who was the judge in the trial, died today.
That's right, yes. And one of the other members of the inquiry, Richard Stone, was chair of JCORE for a number of years, and pioneered a lot of important work, and particularly what was happening to Black prisoners as well. But a really important thing, the whole Macpherson Stephen Lawrence inquiry, and what happened to his parents, and the role his mother plays now in combating racism and being in the House of Lords, and that whole trajectory is a really important one. So there's a lot of, and JCORE would be delighted to help bring to people's attention some of this richness.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you, Edie, for your time and energy and preparation and insights this evening. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. And I'll send you those two things tomorrow, or I'll get John to send it. But thank you very much, and good to see you. Keep well.
Thank you, and you. Wish you a really very good evening.
Thank you very much.